quiet here. All right, look at that. All you need is the panel to sit down and then it gets nice and quiet. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindy Funmutsius, and I'm the director of the Salata Institute's Climate Action Accelerator. And in that role, it is my joy and honor to welcome practitioners to Harvard University and connect them with our students, our alumni, and our faculty, so that we can better learn how to be effective climate solution accelerators in the world. Today, we are very honored to be able to focus our attention on environmental justice and the work of both Harvard's experts and staff, but also the work of some really important practitioners who are leading this work at the federal and state and regional level, and as well as the local level here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, city of Boston. So we're going to structure this with some opening remarks by Chief of Staff of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Dan Utech, and then we'll switch over to a panel discussion and take some questions from you all towards the end. And then that will be followed by a reception across the street that you're all welcome to attend as well. So without further ado, let me introduce Dan Utech. He's the Chief of Staff of the US EPA. Dan has over 20 years of experience in environmental policy. He's served as a deputy assistant to President Obama for energy and climate change, leading the White House and cross-governmental teams to develop and implement energy and climate change policy, including President Obama's Climate Action Plan. Dan has also served as a senior advisor to Energy Secretary Stephen Chu. Prior to his federal agency experience, Dan worked in the United States Senate for 10 years, where he worked on a range of environmental and energy policy issues for Senators Clinton, Corzine, and Baucus. Dan started his Washington career at the EPA as a presidential management intern, and he's been a lecturer at the Yale School of Forestry, hold your hissing, for which he received his master's in environmental studies degree, and he also holds degrees from the Yale School of Management and Amherst College. So Dan, I'd love to welcome you. You can feel free to sit there and stay there, or you can come up here to the podium. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and it's wonderful to be here today and to have such a great audience and have such a fantastic panel, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation, so I'm going to keep this pretty brief. I love the title of the panel, EJ at the EPA and Beyond, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the EPA part of it. I'm particularly interested in the Beyond part of it from my vantage point, and hearing from some of the other panelists about EJ World Beyond EPA. So I'm the Chief of Staff to Michael Regan. He's the administrator of the EPA since March of 2021. He was nominated by President Biden. He's the first Black man to lead the EPA and came to the EPA from North Carolina, where he had run the Department of Environmental Quality there. And I talk about Mr. Regan not just because he's my boss, but because he has really prioritized environmental justice from day one and from before he got to EPA, but he's made it a huge priority for the agency since he got there. And President Biden and the Vice President have also really leaned in here. And I say that mostly to say that this is really a grassroots issue, but where I work at EPA, the leadership from the top really matters, really sets a tone, and also leads to concrete directives to me and everybody else in the agency to work on this issue and to really try to infuse environmental justice principles and considerations into everything that we do at EPA. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of those things, and then I really want to get to the conversation with my co-panelists. So, there's a lot of different ways at EPA that we try to affect change in the world, and I'm just going to talk about a few major actions that we've taken this year that I think are benefit environmental justice communities and lots of other people around the country. So just this year, we issued a rule that will slash cancer-causing pollution and reduce elevated cancer risk from chemical plants by 96%. We proposed new improvements to something we call our lead and copper rule to basically, we propose to require replacement of those lines everywhere in the country within 10 years. We issued final standards for light duty, medium duty, heavy duty vehicles to cut carbon pollution, but also other kinds of pollution from those vehicles, which, as I'm sure you know, many highways are run through low-income disadvantaged communities. So big EJ benefits there. And then finally, in April, we announced a suite of rules to reduce pollution, air pollution, water pollution, to deal with coal ash at power plants all around the country. So on the regulatory side of the house, that's just a few of the things we've done really just in the last sort of 9 months or so. Big EJ benefits from all of that work. We also, as I said, the administrator really got started from day one, and back in 2021, shortly after he got on board, he issued a document guidance to the EPA to, as I said, infuse EJ into everything that we do at the agency. And there are a number of things that have come out of that, and we can unpack that a little bit more on the panel. But I want to highlight one of those things in particular, which was to create, or to elevate, I should say, the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA. So this was an office that was sort of a subunit of the administrator's office, and he elevated that up to be on par with all of the other offices within the agency. So we have an air office, a water office, and other offices that implement our major statutes and that deal with sort of the specific environmental problems that fall under them. But I know it sounds very bureaucratic, but it's really important for what happens inside the agency to have environmental justice now at that same level as all of those other major offices in the agency. And then probably the final thing I'll mention just before wrapping and getting into it with my panelists, thanks to the President's leadership and the work of Congress, we have just extraordinary resources at EPA over the last 3 years to deploy to make progress in EJ all around the country. So we got 2 years ago, $3 billion specifically for environmental justice grants. And we're rolling that out in a variety of ways, and we can talk more about it. That's specifically targeted for environmental justice. I think prior to that point, we had maybe $100 million over 10 or 20 years or something like that. So that's a game changer for us in the way that we engage with communities all around the country and empower them to find solutions that work for them to the problems unique to their communities. We also got about $100 billion for lots of other problems. So $50 billion for water infrastructure, to deal with lead pipes, to deal with PFAS contamination, a whole range of things. $5 billion for school bus funding to replace diesel school buses all around the country. I think to date, 50-60% of those have been in low-income and disadvantaged communities. So just a huge opportunity, thanks to the President's leadership, to make progress on air, water, and other forms of pollution in EJ communities around the country. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap so we can have more time to talk about EJ at EPA and beyond. Thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Hannah Perls. I am a senior staff attorney at something called the Environmental Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. We're like a legal research center. And I have the extraordinary privilege of facilitating this panel. So we'll start with some very brief introductions, and then we're going to try and leave 10 minutes for Q&A. And in between that time, we're going to just fix all the problems and talk about all the stuff. So that is our very ambitious goal. These are abbreviated bios. These are really just extraordinary folks that we have up front. But in the interest of getting to the conversation, please know I shortened them as much as I could. We'll start at the end. Crystal Johnson serves as the Assistant Secretary of Environmental Justice for the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity with the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. She is a senior environmental planner and energy strategist with more than 30 years of experience. And she has also served as a sustainable economy strategist to develop former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson's legacy plan. So welcome, Crystal. Thank you for being here. We know Dan Utech. So David Cash is a regional administrator of EPA's New England office. And before joining EPA, Dr. Cash was dean of the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. Dr. Cash also spent a decade in Massachusetts state government as Assistant Secretary of Policy in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs in the Patrick administration, as a commissioner in the Department of Public Utilities and the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. So welcome, David. And finally, Dwaign Tyndal is the Executive Director at Alternatives for Community Environment, or ACE, a Roxbury-based environmental justice nonprofit here in Boston. He has over 25 years of professional experience in economic development, community and neighborhood development, youth development, and workforce development, and is dedicated to showing how community-based partnerships can build stronger communities and empower residents and businesses to take active roles in their neighborhoods. So really, really welcome. Thank you all for being here. We're gonna start, I think, at the local level. I really wanna ground us in where we are. So Dwaign, I'd love to start with you. And if you could just help us think through, given your experience at ACE, ACE has been around for 30 years now and has really done groundbreaking work on housing justice, transportation justice, a very broad conception of EJ. So can you help us think about what does environmental injustice look like for communities here in Massachusetts? And what does achieving environmental justice look like as you think about solutions going forward?
The injustice is the conscious decision to compromise the public health of Black and brown people, whether it's air quality, water quality, is the proximity to unhealthy activities. It was planned, you get red line, then they put the worst land usage and activities in those neighborhoods, and then you have some predictable public health outcomes. For example, COVID and the pre-existing issues of upper respiratory diseases. We call that asthma. And asthma in Roxbury has such an intimate relationship, and that because of the various diesel, MBTA diesel buses that used to run 24 hours a day, so you have a legacy of public health issues that impacted our communities for generations. And then when COVID hits, it wasn't a surprise that we had some of the highest fatalities of COVID. That's the injustice. It's the life and death ratios that happen when you could trap people in a neighborhood and then you dump the things you don't want in other neighborhoods in that particular neighborhood. So the justice part of it is being able to organize, utilize regulatory and legal frameworks to push back against those land uses, to be able to push the MBTA bus depot out of your neighborhood, stop various asphalt, it was so many different things that was being concentrated in Roxbury that our ancestors and people that came before me fought effectively. And this gave the foundation of Roxbury of being really a vibrant neighborhood where people could actually live, work, and play. And I invite everyone to come through a little bit. It's a store called Nubian Market, which is like a third place cafe, coffee, African-inspired restaurant cafe. But that was the site of Bartlett Yards where the MBTA used to have their diesel buses. So that was a generational change, something that's small, also is a reminder of the legacy of public health, but it also showed that with work on multiple different levels that we could actually move and change processes. And one last thing, wherever you see Black and brown folks, asthma. Wherever you go, doesn't matter. So if that is not a design process, Brockton, doesn't matter. Where you just go, I say, oh, we're the black, brown folks. Asthma, higher rates of asthma, air quality. So this is a decision that society would have to move towards, kind of moving away from how we decide what activities is in what neighborhoods. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate what I heard is sort of the challenge of taking action today to repair a really long legacy and sort of the inertia of those decisions as you're grappling with the housing issues and the transit issues and the public health challenges all at once. So I want to turn to Crystal and talk about actions that are happening at the state level to support the work of groups like ACE, and in particular, how you start to turn the battleship in a way to sort of go back against that inertia. And specifically, you were instrumental in developing an EJ strategy for the state of Massachusetts, which was the first of its kind nationally. And it was released earlier this year, so huge congratulations on that. Can you talk about why it was important to create that strategy document first, and how you're seeing that strategy play out in the decisions that agencies are making at the state level?
Yes, thank you so much. So glad to be here. I appreciate you sharing about what does environmental injustice look like. And for the EEA, and Office of Environmental Justice and Equity, one of the big understandings is that it's quite diverse. It can look like extreme heat, it can be flooding, it can be air quality, public health, asthma, and everything in between. And so as we have a comprehensive approach, it's a lot to address. For where we're starting right now in February, an environmental justice strategy, formerly called the EEA, EJ strategy, was publicly released. It was developed originally under the last administration as a draft, and we released it as a final, added some of the touches based on the Haley Driscoll administration focus and area. And it's a unique document that we're quite happy about, where it's around 160 pages and it has around 13, 14 different sections, where it has for in the Executive Office, Energy and Environmental Affairs, each of the divisions has their own EJ strategy. And that was something that was, again, crafted in the draft, which we really appreciate, because for all the different agencies, which can be Coastal Zone Management, Department of Public Utilities, and everything in between, they each have a different mission and focus in how they bump up against environmental justice or have different histories. And so really needed to have targeted strategies that were relevant to each of those. So one of the things that happened here in the state was with the Haley Driscoll, similar to what you just shared about EPA, where they did some restructuring. So the Haley Driscoll administration elevated, or first created and elevated, the Undersecretary Maria Valen Power in the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity, equal to the Undersecretary of Energy and Environment. Also created one regarding energy, environment, and one for climate. So with that elevation, placed funding for a whole office. There are now 7 of us. But in addition to that, they also provide ample funding so that for all of those different agencies, offices that have their own EJ strategy, that larger one, we have been in the process of hiring EJ liaisons or directors of environmental justice. So each agency has someone that's targeted, because with EJ, we recognize that it's not only externally where it's working with the community, addressing the topics we just mentioned, but that also internally equally, because when you talk about environmental justice, you're addressing systemic barriers that were designed with a thoroughness that you can't even fathom. And so then when you have to look not just outside with solutions, you have to look inside and really start to undo a lot of the knots developed by design. And that can be equally complicated as it is with the outside. So that EJ strategy is something significant. And so that serves as a planning tool where it's for us to then have, what are we gonna plan, implement, manage, track, and we just launched it and working now on those action plannings. One thing I'll just share with that is that while it was for one secretary, Energy Environmental Affairs, we were also working with all the other secretariats And that can be like veterans group, education, housing, living communities, and so forth, where while everybody might have had something with environmental justice, as they usually did in the corner, in the back, on the sides, it now have really moved forward and working with them all to have environmental justice strategies also. And it's designed where we want consistency because we need to make sure it's robust, thorough, and we can all use it as a foundation to move forward. And so one big part of that I'll just share is my office has 33 different priorities. While we inherit most of those, we added those. Some of the top ones are meaningful engagement, it's metrics, cumulative impact, analysis. We have language access, and then we also have ones regarding Indigenous and tribal communities and onward. And so it's quite thorough, and we take it seriously. And I think everybody in my group, change agents, and there's a new face in government as far as the leadership to have a new perspective, build new relations, build trust. And I'm really have the honor to work with a team that are recognize themselves as community activists themselves and bring that vision and mindfulness. And so the EJ strategy is our starting point, and we're moving forward now.
And there's a lot in what you just said, but I think one point that we hear throughout is the importance of elevating these issues, whereas before they might have been something that got talked about, but certainly wasn't top of the list. And so I want to switch to Dan and David. And one thing that both Crystal and Dwaign highlighted is this legacy challenge. This is a structural challenge. And part of that legacy is a legacy of disinvestment. And so funding has been a huge component of the federal government's EJ strategy. And I think the thing that's gotten the most play, or at least has really made the rounds, is Justice 40. So as a quick primer, Justice 40 was created by executive order Biden's first week in office. So again, elevating this to say this is really what we're focusing on. And it means that of certain climate, clean energy, housing, transit programs, 40% of the benefits of those programs have to go to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And this was adapted from something that New York has done through their CLCPA. And so I wanted to ask both of you, one, how significant is this mandate from the president, just in terms of the history of where the president or the White House has been on EJ? And then what types of impacts and benefits are you seeing on the ground for communities as Justice 40 plays out?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Why don't I start, David, and then you can give your perspective from the region. I think it's hugely important. I think, as we've been talking about, I think the signals from the top really matter. If you're in a big organization like the federal government and EPA as a kind of unit underneath that, these executive orders really matter, and they set expectations for us in terms of what the president's looking for. They also empower people inside of these organizations to use that document and take it around and say, we need to be doing this in a way that really makes a difference inside EPA and other agencies. So I think we have nearly 80 of our programs, 80 of our funding programs that are now under Justice 40. We started with some pilots because we just hadn't done this before in this way. But we've now expanded that greatly. And we have a lot of different kinds of programs at EPA. So we fund cleanup of contaminated sites. We fund water infrastructure. We're funding work at states and localities to put up solar panels and to do other things to reduce pollution. So, I think for all these programs are designed a little bit differently. So I think the definitions might vary a little bit from community to community as far as what's a low-income disadvantaged community for purposes of that program. But for this year, for 2024, so far, and I think we expect by the end of the year that of the funding that we're putting out this year, which will be tens of billions of dollars, that we're going to be more like 60%, not 40%. Going to benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities. And I think that's a reflection of both what we heard as we were designing these programs in terms of from those communities and the need in those communities. And I think also the the commitment of people at the agency to the mission. David?
Yeah, so on the ground, both within the agency and on the actual ground in communities, we've seen that change happening within the regional office. So EPA there are 10 regional offices. We're Region 1, that's New England, the 6 New England states, and the 10 federally recognized tribes. And at the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, all of our teams, permitting teams, our water team, our air team, our grants team, all started working on how do we integrate environmental justice and Justice 40 into everything that we're doing. So we've changed how we do permits, we changed how we engage with communities, we changed how we do granting. So that's kind of on the organizational dimension. On the ground, what this has looked like is, for example, 5 electric school buses going to the city of Lawrence, which has one of the highest rates of asthma in the state, and getting 5 smelly, stinky school buses, diesel school buses, off the street. What that means for a family is standing on the street corner with their kid and not worrying that their kid is going to have an asthma attack because they have the higher probability than other parts of the state. What that means is that school teachers there don't have to stand at the end of the day on the curb when all the buses come breathing in those fumes. It means that the bus drivers also. So big impacts there. It also means, for example, one of the big funding programs that we have is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. Every state had the opportunity to compete for, first they had a year to develop climate plans that had to have environmental justice components to it. Then they competed for $4.5 billion. By the way, can I just make a point? We've been saying like billion over and over again. Like, do you realize how big that is in terms of investments in climate right now? This is unprecedented in this country to be making these kind of investments. I heard one analogy where if you're counting to 1 million seconds, it takes like 11 days. And if you're counting to 1 billion seconds, it takes like 30 years. So this is huge. And the impacts are these kinds that I just described to you. So all the states are competing for this pot of $4.5 billion. 5 New England states got together to do heat pumps. Heat pumps, that might sound a little boring, except when you realize that homes in low income and disadvantaged communities are more likely to not be weatherized and not be heated well. Maybe they don't even have air conditioning in our now sweltering summers where we have routine 90-degree days. And so this heat pump program is going to retrofit homes, 500,000 homes in New England. That's an on-the-ground impact. What these also mean are the opportunity for huge green job growth here, and precisely in those communities that might not have had opportunities to take advantage of big booms in the past. Again, if you're in the Boston area, you're familiar with the IT boom and the pharma boom and the biotech boom, all of which bypassed communities. Communities of color, low-income communities. In fact, one could say resulted in gentrification in areas that pushed some of these communities out. So the whole idea here is to be investing in communities, sustainably investing in communities. And one of the big on-the-ground impacts this has had, both within our organization and with community groups, is how do we facilitate federal funding? Federal funding is really complicated. For a long time, a lot of these communities did not have the capacity or ability to try to get federal funding. Very complicated process, and we've put a lot of things in place to reduce those barriers, whether it's technical assistance, funding entire organizations. So we have these things called Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers. Every region has one. There are a couple of national ones. Ours is based at University of Connecticut, but works in all 6 states and with all 10 tribes. And basically, they're a go-to place that a community group like ACE can call up and say, hey, we've heard about this grant, or are there any grants? How do we sign up for those? How can we apply? How can we manage the funding? We know there are all kinds of requirements. We want to make sure the money is spent wisely. There's integrity, there's credibility in the system. So all of these kinds of things we're stepping up in a way that throughout EPA, there's been small programs because that's how the funding happened. And now they're on a scale that's really going to have a huge impact. There are already over 350 electric school buses in New England alone. And that's just one of the many billions of dollars of programs that are going on the street.
Actually, a perfect segue, because I would love to also talk about a new role that ACE is filling in the region with another funding program that is being run by EPA, which is the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities grant making program. So ACE is now a regional grant maker as an EPA partner. So I'd love to hear how that's going, how you see it supporting the communities that you've served now for 3 decades, and sort of where you see the potential with that program going forward.
It's different. Meaning a neighborhood organization front-facing the federal bureaucracy. You don't have the state, you don't have a municipality, you're front-facing the federal bureaucracy. So there is a learning curve, but it's a manageable learning curve. The level of contact, I think we have like weekly meetings with folks from Region 1 to kind of manage and navigate the process. And I think the most important thing is developing a different culture, a different pattern of engagement. Like, no federal bureaucracy is going to be perfect. So some folks in Roxbury had some bad taste relative to some EPA funding in the past. But we believe under this process, like, we can actually learn, engage, negotiate this process to benefit our neighborhoods. We can have honest conversations. We can see where we need to improve as organizations on our back end to manage federal grants. And we will subtly remind EPA that this should be a little bit more user-friendly. And hopefully we get somewhere in the middle.
I don't think so subtle all the time, which is good.
But the thing is that we are finally front-facing real resources. Because when we heard about the amount, it was kind of like a movement shock. People wasn't used to hearing big numbers like that. So a little bit cynicism and being stunned, and now that it is here, now we could say, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like, this is the cost to your organization back end to be able to take in those resources. And it's a change for neighborhood organizations. And I'm looking forward to see how this get played out in the next 3 years. How we're doing it, we bringing in all of our partners, we bringing in our philanthropy friends, we try to bring in our private sector allies, just to have a different conversation what a neighborhood-driven process looks like relative to federal funding. And then in the harsh reality, it's still somewhat of a competition relative to other solutions, environmental solutions that we may not agree with. So, but at least it's leveling the playing field that we could have those real conversations without kind of like, oh, we got to wait for the city of Boston, or we got to wait for the state bureaucracy to figure out. The ball is closer to us now that we could actually act on it.
One thing I really appreciate you saying, and David kind of joked about, is there is like a re-education process that's happening inside the government. So as all this money's coming out, you mentioned the Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers, the Tic Tacs. One thing I've heard an EPA official sort of bemoan is, we got all the money and we got the Tic Tacs at the same time. But what we needed was the Tic Tacs to be in place. And then we needed the money to come out so that we were fully prepped to make sure this money got to the communities. And so we're definitely building the plane as we're flying it, but I also really appreciate what you're saying, which is fundamentally this is about people and relationships and trust. And so, Crystal, I wanted to ask you about this educational component and sort of retraining within government. How do we assess our processes? How do we figure out what's not working for communities, even if it's working for government? And then what are the steps you're taking to actually change those processes? And David, you alluded to this as well, sort of how do we identify and actually remove those barriers to make sure this works on the ground?
That's a great question. For some of the things that we're doing, I could talk for days about things that are very layered and moving forward. as we mentioned, we have the environmental justice strategy, and as I mentioned, meaningful engagement was one of the components, and that's really significant, not just for needing to have engagement, wanting to hear their voices concerned, but also to build relations, build trust, and have it become something really authentic. So what we've done is, while there is an Environmental Justice Council, which is a governor-appointed council of around 15 people, that has always, or the different councils have always existed, because environmental justice roots are so grassroots, it was really recognized there's no way you could have just a council of appointed networks, because it leaves out the historic players that for decades have been saying there's something wrong, you know? And so how do we engage that? So we do have like a Justice 40, we called it, network. It was originally designed because as the state was going for grants, wanted to make sure, because we appreciate that the requirement of how is this going in scope and budget or benefiting, and that put pressure needed to make sure that those pursuing it said, wow, we need to engage with the community. We need to make sure we can show ample conversations, how it's changed the outcome. And so that helped us structure the Justice 40 to have one mechanism to bring all the different agencies going for the variety of different grants to a network that was statewide. And it would originally start off with like maybe 10, 20, now we have over 120 networks, and it's still growing because many EJ, community-based organizations, they're all focused on different aspects. Some are focused on workforce, some are focused on energy burden, you know, some are focused on flooding or youth. And so they're all related, but they're still distinct. And so we network with all of them to make sure that they have a place to learn more, give their voice, be part of advisory groups, and we're constantly building in subgroups and others to keep these relations, to build that type of trust. Then it goes into other layers. I don't know if I could save for later, but you know, how are we engaging on budget and changing things? Like when I mentioned there's the external and the internal, that internal and the planning on that with equitable procurement, and then looking at how we're doing grants, where the grants we're applying for, how does it account for equity? And then the grants we're giving out, how does it account? Because historically, it was designed and left out communities. So we're really going back. And then as we move forward, how do we make sure that our grant process does work for EJ networks, that, because they always were an organization that catered to or advocated for a marginalized, underserved group. They didn't have a lot of resources themselves. And so many of them weren't official 501c3s. They didn't do the paperwork. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the capacity. So then now as we give out grants, we're like, okay, maybe we can allow them to have a fiscal agent, because for X number of years, they've served that community brilliantly, but they're not official. And we can say, wow, we do want to give a grant, but you know what? It can't be reimbursable, because who has $50,000 sitting there? So how do we pay things up front? Then we also say like, wow, you know what? Sometimes grants say you can use it for capital, but not operations and planning and people. And so we're like, if we did a survey, we said to them, again, building relationships, like, what do you need? What is your voice? What's the problems? What's the barriers? And assess that. And so we're constantly in conversation to try to learn more. And I had shared before earlier, there's so many layers of how you get down to building trust, building relations, and it takes the conversation to a new evolution. And we're still learning.
There's one thing I flagged that I don't think we've named explicitly, but we've talked about how there's been this systematic, and you talked about sort of this ongoing onslaught of placing things in certain communities, sort of a disinterest in understanding what those impacts are. And I appreciated the examples you gave, because I think there is this sort of sense, well, it must have been intentional. And certainly it was when we look at redlining and the legacy of how those decisions were made. But then, you know, no one would say, well, it's discriminatory to only offer these things to 501c3s. But it has that disparate effect. And so I really appreciate what you were talking about, just sort of the curiosity of how is this actually playing out for communities, and how can we use the authorities we have to change those barriers that might make perfect sense when you're thinking about record keeping on the government side, but they don't make sense when it comes to achieving the goals of the EJ strategy. And let me know if I'm phrasing that right. But I think framing it up and making sure we're talking about things that no one sort of intended to go wrong, but it's just not.
Actually, I will clarify that reframing, because I
Sure.
think historically, because the history in the country, things were designed in a certain way with certain lines and barriers. So to say it wasn't the intention doesn't capture what I would like it to capture, because I do feel things, there are systemic, from education systems to the banking system and the housing and public health and disparities. It isn't random.
I really appreciate that. Before, I have one last question for the whole group, but I first just wanted to make sure we go beyond funding. So certainly, and this is for Dan and David, EPA has a host of other mandates under its statutes. And so, Dan, you talked in the beginning about rulemakings, but certainly there are other powers that EPA has that could and are being leveraged for environmental justice. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how, with this overarching EJ mandate, you're now looking at enforcement and other policy mandates that the agency is executing.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think lots of layers, lots of facets to this, and so yes, enforcement. So I should be able to tick them off, and I can't. What our enforcement office's 5 priorities are, but environmental justice is one of those, along with climate and others. So, again, that's one of these signals inside of EPA to, in this case, a specific group of people. Our enforcement team, which is split between headquarters and then part of our council office in every region in the country, to prioritize that work. I mean, it's, we talk about this extraordinary resources they've gotten, and it's amazing. Most of that is passing through the agency. Not all of it can be used for just whatever we might want to use it for. And so for our enforcement team, which of course is, in prior years was one of the places not well funded at EPA, we made some progress in restoring that. Those folks, other folks at the agency, have decisions to make about, do I pick up this folder? Do I pick up that folder? How am I going to use my time today? And I think that's the kind of way in which setting EJ as a priority within the enforcement program makes a really big difference.
One sort of, we'll definitely get to Q&A, so this is just ending sort of the part of the panel that I'm in charge of. As we look ahead, I want to get really concrete about how we think about success. And yeah, there we go. And I think one of the really sort of key challenges, and certainly we're seeing this with Justice 40, is that success in environmental justice and the benefits that we're looking for look really different, not just agency to agency, like HUD versus EPA, but even community to community. Even just Roxbury versus Rosendale versus Jamaica Plain, it looks very, very different. And so in the spheres that you all occupy, how do you think about, what are the metrics you look for to know, what, I did my job today, my community is getting better? What are the ways that you know that progress is being made?
You want to go first?
You don't have to go first, you can delegate.
I mean, I'd be, there could be a very long list, but one thing I would look for are asthma rates going down in the communities that historically have shown high rates. And then you could take asthma and change it with lead in water or, other problems with drinking water, the whole list of those kinds of things. And that's what if in 10 years from now, we look at our EJ screen, which is a map that shows layers of those kind of impacts, and we see a whole lot less red colors in there, it will mean that we've succeeded. It will mean that families are not rushing to the emergency room with an asthma attack that their kid's having, which means that the kid's missing school and the parents are missing time at work and all of the other impacts that are related to that. We'll see less of that. On these hot days, we want to integrate now climate into this. On these, we know that places like Boston are experiencing more high heat days. So we'll see fewer impacts if we've done our job right. We'll see fewer health impacts, even though we know they're that. And then at the end of the day, of course, we've been talking about climate optimism earlier today. We'll see fewer heat days, and that those won't impact those communities, because we know that communities do feel the greater impacts. So a long, long list of those things that we care about.
Yeah, I think, to just add a little bit from the EPA vantage point to what David said, so, and this sort of brings it up a level on the air pollution side. We set standards, ambient air quality standards for particulate matter, for ozone, and, when we look at those maps 10 years from now, I hope we see a lot better, color coding on those pollutants in particular in EJ communities across the country. I hope that we have completed cleaning up all the Superfund sites that are on our list, many of which are in or near EJ communities. I hope we've been able to, through our brownfields program, remediate some of the more lightly contaminated sites around the country, and in partnership with communities, return those to some new productive use for the community, whether that's new housing, a park, anything, really what the community wants that to be. So there's just a few other ways. I hope that through our programs, through this funding, through the regulations and other enforcement, other tools that we have, that we're going to see tangible progress in that time frame.
Can I just add a quick footnote? Because Dan mentioned brownfields and our investments in communities where there's been not as bad as Superfund level pollution that transforms them in a way that the communities want. We also know there's a danger of gentrification when that happens. So if we can get it right and get what the community wants with allowing for the community to stay there in this new place with, that's been cleaned up and has new opportunities for outdoor recreation or residential or commercial, that's, something that we also are keeping our eye on. It'd be a good indicator. Sorry.
No worries. Definitely everything that said, metrics, the reporting, the tracking, the monitoring, the public review of such, the comment that keeps everything, and I value that. One thing I do want to share, because you said something significant, you said, like at the end of the day, what makes you feel that there's a measure of success, and I want to talk about one element that builds off of that, is it's like the human element. While I talked about some of those inequities that as being real versus random, and the systemic barriers out there across so many different areas, which we're talking about on the public health, environmental and justice, is that when I have peers who have gained an understanding of their choices in project management and their leadership, that they see how benefits and burdens historically had been moved, and then they see the perspective and it changes. Because there's so many different ways to make sure the right thing is done, but until people embody doing the right thing who are in positions of power, that to me is the greater impact, because that person can change all their projects and so forth. So that's really nice, is watching somebody have an aha moment who might have lived in a demographic that couldn't fathom the magnitude of injustices, and then having an awakening moment and designing a program, engaging in a new way that undoes that. And that's really significant.
Since I work in neighborhoods, the hard metrics are good, but it's the power issue. It's the expectations of residents that they should have access to clean air and healthy lives. And that's something a little bit harder to change when you become not comfortable, but it's a part of your life so consistently. So the hope is that we have this reinvestment of the power of community, how we move forward, and how we control our systems, whether it's a municipal, state, or federal, that this is our ownership. We own this. These are our resources. It's not EPA resources. It's not HUD resources. This is the resources of our communities that are being redirected and reinvested back into the community. And if we could kind of communicate that and express that and expect that, that changed the environment, the politics, the economics going forward.
there's linear metrics that we can follow in a quantitative way. And then in your response, I heard very much sort of a personal, interpersonal, transformational relationship. And then we have structural transformation at the end, where these power dynamics look extremely different. No pressure, but on that, are there any questions from the audience? We have about 20 minutes, and then we'll head over to the reception. And how do you want to do mics?
Mics.
Maybe what we can do, so there's a ton of questions. Maybe what we can do is do 3 at a time. And then folks can sort of pick and choose what they want to respond to. So,
And maybe if you have a question, move to an aisle or raise your hand so that it's easy for the microphone.
1, 2, and then I saw you with the white t-shirt. And then I'm going to try and remember the other faces so we go in order.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm EPA from Ohio, and if I can answer the question that you last asked, how do we know the progress is being made in the communities? I think somebody who comes from a background of a nonprofit, working in a red line community in Cleveland, now working for the largest energy aggregator, serving 240 communities. We have submitted. Cleveland has been thanks a lot. Speaking of gratitude, we got the CPRT for both planning and implementation grant. We got solar for all, and currently, we just 2 weeks ago we submitted, our first community change grant as well. But I think the one aspect that I think we are fundamentally, and foundationally thankful for is the social connectedness, and the unprecedented funding also brought unprecedented relationship building with entities. Like never before. So I'm happy to talk more, but I don't want to I just want to express my thanks.
That's great.
And there will definitely be time at the reception, so that's really great to sort of put a pin in it for exactly those connection buildings. So we would love if folks can join the reception as well. Who is next?
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm at the Kennedy School. Thank you all so much for coming and for moderating the panel. My understanding of the IRA is that it was landmark for many reasons, among that for the environmental justice provisions. And I'm wondering if you had a magic wand, and to the extent of my knowledge, some of you might have a magic wand, and some billions of dollars here and there for kind of specific EJ provisions, but we're talking about trillions of dollars being crowded in from the private sector as well into all sorts of climate innovations. What provisions would you have included, or if you could do it today in kind of a post-West Virginia v. EPA world, what would you include on how that capital should be allocated to make sure that the fruits of innovation actually make it to communities and we're not looking at another kind of biotech bubble in Boston?
One more question and then we'll
Okay.
next to the panel. Who is the other person? Is it you in the back?
Hi, everyone. My name is Cici Chen. I'm an economist working on the EJ impacts of truck electrification. I have 2 questions. My first question is, how does EJ at EPA and beyond connect to or impacted by its broader kind of society emphasis on distributional consequences or implications? So I know there's this new guideline A94 and A4 from OMB, Office of Management Budget, that advocates for the use of distributional weights to do cost-benefit analysis. I wonder how that's connected to what EPA is doing in terms of environmental justice. My second question is really kind of more broad about like what can economists help in this area? Thank you.
Pick whatever you want.
Well, I'll take the second one. Economists could deal with the externalities of these so-called solutions. Because the culture of false solutions and the impact on Black and brown communities is not captured well. It's not articulated well. So we go into hydrogen, we go into carbon capturing, we go into relining nuclear power, and we talk about the benefits of it. But how does it impact other communities? How do we factor in to that part? How do we think about the total When we do our modeling, do we model in communities that historically has been ignored? And that's the issue that we have with, economics. Sometimes they pick what they want to analyze, and the things that doesn't fit their model, they leave it out. So only thing we want is a fuller picture so we can have or stay away from potential false solutions. That's just my little pet peeve, my bad.
I just wanted to pick up, I'm sorry, I've lost the thread a little bit on questions. I'm gonna leave the magic wand to other people because, as far as I'm concerned, there was a magic wand waved and the IRA was enacted and the president signed it, and that was just amazing. And it's been called a lot of things, including, the biggest climate bill in world history, which I think is in fact true. I'd love to hear from others about things they might want to change. I wanted to pick up on I'm glad to hear about how some of these programs are touching down in the Cleveland area. And it hit for me the question about what do we hope to see in terms of benefits and real results in communities. And it varies a lot by the programs that we're talking about, but we want to get rid of all the lead pipes all around the country. And we want to get people trained in these clean energy technologies and employed. We want to see families saving money because they're benefiting from the Solar for All program or some of these other programs. So I think there's just a lot of really good things that can come out of it. But I'm going to leave the wand to my co-panelists here to talk about.
I mean, I kind of agree with you. When you asked the question, I was kind of stumped because in my position and then with all our colleagues, we've just been running as fast as we can to keep up with the huge thing that IRA and bill are. And I've actually, on the kind of flip side, been incredibly impressed with a lot of the wisdom in those bills. And to come back to your point about networks, there are requirements in the notice of funding that requires the building of networks, right? We know that this can't be done with one central green bank, for example. There's got to be community lenders that understand the communities they're in, that understand the states that they're in, the cities they're in. And so there's a lot of requirements to do the kind of networking that otherwise would never have happened because there are large costs to make those networks happen. And now there is a lot of benefits from that. So that kind of combines both of your questions. But yeah, I also would love to hear if there are other magic wands, because I've been too busy dealing with this magic wand in a great way. So.
I just want to say that cleaner energy is not clean energy. Someone will suffer the impact of this change. And historically, it's been our communities. So that's the harsh reality that we're dealing with. When you invest $4.6 trillion in basically resetting the energy board, we know historically who's been impacted. And the politics and the history of the United States have not changed. So the challenge for us with all these resources, can we change the internal politics of who suffers the most with change?
One comment I would add from the state perspective is that two things would be nice that would help on our end is, I know there have been some states that have been awarded and they came in well above the 40, which I think was amazing, and I was thrilled about it. And that then allowed me to have to go to the people that we were working with applying and saying, the 40 is a minimum. And to be competitive, you're assuming these other states are doing what you're doing, but you don't know. And to leverage, and it might have, I haven't seen it, leverage what people are coming in at and who's getting awarded as an incentive that really drives it, because it puts incredible pressure and makes it easier to sell that. And the other part is what we had to do that would be wonderful is, I believe, and I could be wrong, you can correct me, that reporting and monitoring and something might be a little bit leaner than it could be. So then on our end, one thing we did was that, yes, if there was funding awarded, how do we know it really went there in some certain ways, and reporting back and penalties, right? So then on ours, we put in plenty of check places to make sure, because again, historically within equities, money's always been said it's going there, but it goes there. And to have those different, again, checkpoints for it, but those would be ones that moving forward, be like, that would help states even further. But thrilled for this rare, unprecedented time, thrilled.
We have one down here. You see better than I do.
Hi, I'm George Clark, the Environment and Sustainability Librarian here at Harvard. And from my perspective, it's been great to hear about the statistics and the funding, right? But could we maybe for a second switch it to storytelling? Because if you think of like a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph, right, that can change hearts and minds and also turn the billions into trillions, right? But there's an argument to be made that the federal government in particular has become a worse environmental storyteller over the last 90 years, right? Because you have the WPA and Farm Services Administration photographs documenting the lives of coal miners and Dust Bowl migrants and everything in the 30s, right? And then there was this great program in the 70s before somebody told the EPA what they couldn't do called Documerica, where they sent similar droves of photographers out into our cities and across the country. Some of the really most important photographs about people of color from the 70s that are widely available are from that project. So that's thinking about storytelling in time, right? If we think about storytelling across the federal government, NASA, right? They spend millions getting computer models and artists and space campers to talk about what might happen in 10 years, right? Where's EPA's project like that? Where's the funding to tell EPA's story, and how can EPA send out the photographers and other people to document how people live with environmental contamination and how they find joy in our cities and all those sorts of issues.
Yeah, well, that's a great point and a good question. I think one thing I want to say in response is just to encourage everybody to follow my boss's social media feeds, Michael Regan, our administrator, because he thinks visually, he's a good visual storyteller, and he's out in communities all around the country, has been for the last 3.5 years, from Lowndes County, Alabama, to, the tribal communities in the Arctic. And so, he's been doing some sort of personal documentation of that himself, and that's one way that we're trying to tell those stories. I know David does the same thing in his work here in New England, but I think it's your broader question is well taken.
Yeah, I mean, it's unlike the kind of big blocks of money that are going to build up our staff for environmental justice, for example, there isn't like a huge block that says, okay, here's your communications, right? But all of the regions have communication teams, and clearly your question means we're not doing it well enough, we're not getting out enough, but boy, we're trying to do it and trying to make it visual, and he's right, the administrator just tells the stories so powerfully. I mean, he started early on in the administration. He did a Journey to Justice tour in the South. He's done it in a couple of different places, including Appalachia, all of which include kind of stories of people's lives and how they've been impacted by poor water quality and what opportunities they have. And I know that that's the effort that I take, and I know I drive our communication staff kind of crazy because, I will love to do things like what I did yesterday morning, which was go to a site in Somerville on the Mystic River where part of our environmental education funding has gone to a local group to take kids out on canoes. Kids who live within a half a mile of the Mystic River and have never been to this park, never been in a canoe. So I was lucky enough yesterday to go in a canoe with 10 kids, one of these huge canoes. We did not capsize, so victory. It was a great day. But telling the story about outside access. And I try to do this as much as I can. I'll just relay one other story that's really stuck with me. I went to a site in Fall River where bill funding, bipartisan infrastructure law funding, was used to remove lead pipes. And I'm standing there at the pit where this team is pulling the stuff out, and I see a mom holding her kid in the window, like a 2 or 3 year old. And, I'm envisioning that, well, I know the kid is like excited about the backhoe. But I'm envisioning that the mother is like, thank goodness, I do not have to worry when I turn on the tap tomorrow because of what's happened here. And I think those stories we have to tell more of those stories. And there's so many of them. This is impacting real people's lives in very fundamental ways. And so you're right, we have to tell those stories more and better.
So real quick, as a nonprofit, we include and integrate art into our policy work. So we was doing our building admissions work, and we created an animation that showed a mother and child dealing with asthma. We was working with Northeastern doing their climate plan, and to celebrate it, we had a concert with poetry, hip hop, music. Like art needs to be embedded into our work because that's the culture. So we aren't as kind of like maybe limited as bureaucracies. We could raise resources to kind of promote and show the art, but to be able to tell the story, the natural story through the art of the people. And that's what we have been trying to integrate into our work. So when you say that, it's photography, it's music, it's the totality of what makes culture. And I agree with you. That's something that we need to be reminded of.
I think we have room for one more question, and I know that, I don't know your name, but kerchief on your head, you've had your hand up a lot. So why don't we take a question from you? And then I think we have more time at the reception to keep these conversations going.
Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Daniela. I'm at the Kennedy School. And before I came to Harvard, I was working on federal climate policy advocacy, pulling on threads of what you said, Dwaign, about cleaner energy not necessarily being clean, and on meaningful engagement being a super important priority. Real progress, I think, moves at the pace of trust. So how do you deal with permitting processes for clean energy and transition, where we have, estimates saying, oh, you need to triple the size of the grid, triple the size of your wind and solar arrays, and there's all this urgency. How do you permit cleaner energy while building meaningful engagement processes that actually build in communities in a way they haven't before?
It's a really good question. And I think, we were talking about this issue a little bit earlier, and I think, I know at EPA one of the parts of the permitting process that we're involved in is NEPA and looking at the NEPA work of other agencies. And that's the National Environmental Policy Act. So environmental impact analysis associated with federal decision making, and so that's kind of my lens into this world. And I think, what we've learned at EPA in looking at, lots of analyses and projects that other agencies are leading on over the years is that, going slow to go fast is often the best answer, meaning get everybody in, really do that engagement up front, and that's probably the most important thing you can do if you really want to have your process go as smoothly as it can. That doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting that, obviously you can't get to yes in every case and you shouldn't, but I think you got to do that work up front.
I would say transparency in process. I think we do move at a pace of trust, and sometimes bureaucracies create rabbit holes that, try and be slick to get. So the struggle is like, how can you create processes that are transparent? Win, lose, or draw. Let us know how the hot dogs are made, and let us kind of deal with that, because we could build and improve on it. But when you lose trust, then you start creating the separation, you shut down communications, and the expectations are lowered. So the technical piece is we're going to continue to push for legislation that benefit frontline communities. The private sector may or may not agree. The bureaucracy may or may not agree. But if we could create a fishbowl that we could look into and say, this is what happened. This shouldn't have happened. Let's send it out to the world. It's not this top secret. Only the smart people and the beautiful people understand it, that we could democratize this process as much as we can. I believe that it's a possibility that we could have some hope moving this stuff forward.
Thank you. I think that's actually a great note to end on. So I have the pleasure of sending you all to a reception across the street in the Maxwell Dworkin building at 33 Oxford Street. So please feel free to join us there, continue the conversation, network a little bit with some EJ practitioners and other students and faculty. And thank you all for being with us this afternoon. It was really great to have you here. And thanks to our panel.